"Hey, old man, you still alive?" someone shouted, and an empty beer can slammed against the old pickup truck of James Hall right in the middle of a gas station on the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma. 65-year-old Margaret Hall flinched as three young men laughed and recorded them on their phones, while one of them deliberately shoved shopping carts straight into her legs. James slowly turned around, his hands trembling not from fear, but from age and the pain of old wounds he had suffered back in Europe during World War II. But the boys didn't know that. To them, they were just two old losers living in a worn-out house at the edge of town, people nobody cared about anymore. They didn't know that Margaret had once pulled wounded soldiers from a bombed-out field hospital in France while shells exploded around her, and that James, at only 20 years old, had survived the bloody Battle of the Bulge and watched his friends die in his arms. All their lives they stayed silent about the war, worked hard, helped people, and believed that the country they fought for would never abandon them. But now, everything had changed. After the death of their son, they were left completely alone, and the neighborhood they had lived in for decades slowly became a place of humiliation. Teenagers threw trash into their yard every week. Someone spray-painted old monsters across their garage, and one night their mailbox was even set on fire. The police came, but nobody had seen anything. Margaret stopped leaving the house after sunset because one evening a group of boys surrounded her near a store and mocked her shaking hands and old military jacket. That night, she cried quietly in the kitchen while holding an old photograph of her and James standing young and smiling in military uniforms beside an American flag in 1945. James sat silently on the porch, staring down the empty road, as if waiting for friends who had died long ago. But the worst came a few days later. Returning home from the grocery store, they found the windows smashed and the words, "It's time for the grave," painted across their front door in red. Margaret nearly collapsed, while James stood frozen for a long moment staring at the message. Then he slowly walked into the bedroom, pulled out an old metal box filled with medals, placed it on the table, and for the first time in years, quietly said, "I survived German bullets, but I never thought I'd live long enough to see my own people hate us more." The next morning, Margaret woke up to strange noises outside. At first, she thought those same boys had returned to torment them again. But when she pulled back the curtain, her hands began to shake. The entire street was filled with vehicles carrying American flags, and veterans in uniform were gathering in front of their house. Old Marines, former soldiers, officers, young servicemen with medals across their chests. At the front stood a tall man in a United States Marine Corps uniform. His name was Colonel Michael Reeves. He held an old black-and-white photograph in his hands and looked directly at James Hall. When James stepped onto the porch, the colonel slowly approached him and saluted. The entire street fell silent. "Sir, my grandfather served in your unit during the Battle of the Bulge," Michael said quietly. "He spent his whole life telling us how you pulled him out of a burning tank when everyone thought he was already dead." James said nothing. He simply stared at the photograph of young soldiers where he stood beside a man he barely remembered anymore. It turned out the video of them being humiliated at the gas station had spread across the internet overnight. People began learning who the Halls really were. Soon, reporters, veterans, and ordinary Americans arrived outside their home, carrying flowers and flags. And those same teenagers who had laughed at them now stood silently to the side because their own parents had dragged them there. One of the boys, the one in the red cap, couldn't even lift his eyes from the ground. Colonel Reeves then loudly read the wartime history of Margaret and James in front of the entire neighborhood. He spoke about how Margaret saved 7 soldiers under heavy bombardment in France, and how James was wounded while covering his unit's retreat during battle. People began to cry. Old neighbors who had ignored them for years lowered their heads in shame. Then came the moment James never expected. Young Marines lined up along the street and simultaneously saluted both him and Margaret. Margaret's knees nearly gave out from emotion, and James, who had never cried even during the war, suddenly couldn't stop his voice from trembling. He looked at the flags, the people shouting "Thank you for your service," and quietly whispered to his wife, "We thought they forgot us, but maybe our country still remembers its soldiers."